Podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and today I got three more stories for you this week, all about weird weapons from history. Just, things that happened that were out of the ordinary, for the most part. We've talked before, I think, we talked a while back about Khan Janabeg from, I don't even know what episode that was, to be honest with you. But maybe it was like an episode on like war stories, but he launched the carcasses and the corpses of bodies that had died from the Black Plague into a city. And that's a weird weapon. All right. This kind of probably not getting that weird today, but it's just out of the ordinary. But before we do that, I want to take a moment. All right. I feel like the world is constantly pointing out the negative. All right. But I want to take a minute to acknowledge a good thing that happened. And by good, I mean it happened the way it should have happened, which is just, that's the low bar that we have set as a society, so that when something goes the way that it is supposed to, when something goes the way that it is designed and intended to do, it's a miracle. It is an absolutely joyous, celebratory moment. And I had one of those, which doesn't seem to happen a lot, but I had one of those moments. All right. So, for those of you who know me personally, you know how far ahead I'm recording at this point, because this happened a couple of months ago. But as I am sitting here recording this, I sliced my thumb. All right. I was making pickles, as I do sometimes, and I was using a mandolin. And guess what? If you don't really pay full attention to where you're slicing, you go and get your finger and not the fruit or vegetable that you were trying to slice to begin with. And holy cow, like, I really hope fruits and vegetables don't feel pain, because going through a mandolin slicer, that hurts, right? And so I'm slicing cucumbers to make pickles, and I just wasn't paying attention, I guess, and I got farther down on the cucumber than I thought I was, and just skleek right there into my thumb, right into it, not clean through, which honestly might have been, actually, no, if I had just sliced a whole chunk out of my thumb pad, I think that would have been worse. But I got in there, and then I pulled it out. Luckily, did not bleed on the cucumber, so that was pretty sweet. Immediately went to put pressure on it, did all the right things, ran it under the water. I was up to date on my tetanus shots. All that was fine. But I didn't want to go to urgent care because I didn't want to pay for that. Right? Because one, your boy doesn't have health insurance, and there's a lot of reasons why, namely can't afford it right now. All right. Because here's the thing. Here's what's absolutely bonkers about, we're going to go down this side road for a second. What's absolutely bonkers in our country right now is that one urgent care visit and one annual physical, all right, based on the health insurance that was available to me, for me as just a one person, not even adding on wife and child, because I definitely can't afford that. But just for me, all right, would have been $200 a month out of my paycheck. All right. So that's $2,400 for a calendar year. One urgent care visit, which ended up costing me $200. And then my annual physical, which will cost me like $350 for out of pocket, That puts me at about $550. I am still plus $1,800 or $1,900 just for running the risk of just not killing myself, essentially. And that's not that, ugh, you know, that's just not cool, man. I think there's got to be a better way. Anyway, that's beside the point. It's not the point of the story. The point is, I tried to put pressure on the wound, and I held it up. I kept pressure on it for like 45 minutes. Didn't move it. Didn't check. Didn't make a peek. Whatever. But 45. It's still bleeding, and bleeding a lot. All right, I bleed a lot. For some reason, I will never forget this moment. There was a kid that I went to high school with, just the most redneck person ever. And I don't even know what he was talking about one day, but he made the comment that something was bleeding like a freight train. And I never understood that phrase until this moment, because my thumb was bleeding like a freight train. I don't even know. I can't explain it beyond that, but it was bleeding a lot. And so I was like, well, darn, I got to go to the urgent care. So I go to the urgent care. All right. Now, in the past, when I or others that I have known have had to go to urgent care, the urgent part of the care, that's pretty loose terminology. All right. You go to urgent, or at least it was called immediate care, which is even more far-fetched because it was not immediate at all. But you go, and then you still ended up sitting in the lobby for 45 minutes to an hour for God knows, because there's nobody else there. It's not like there's this constant throng of people coming in with hatchet wounds and, hemorrhages and severed limbs or whatever. There's not. It's usually just people with the flu, and they can wait, right? It's not trauma. I have trauma. All right. I am actively bleeding, and I get in there, and the woman's very nice. She's not inconvenienced at all by my presence, which is also not expected from customer service these days. And I get it. People suck, but like, your job is to be nice to people, and they can't do it. And so I fill out the papers, and I sat there for probably 5 minutes. And then I was taken back to the procedure room. The nurse there, she got everything ready. She gave me a little dish of soap water that kind of stung a little bit, but not bad. Put my thumb in there so I could clean and bleed a little bit more, whatever. Basically, I'd spent an hour in there getting, taped up and patched up and all that. And that's fine. All right. Because I was being attended to the entire time. All right. It's not like doctor came in and then forgot about me and let me sit there for another 45 minutes, which has happened before. No, just constant checking in. Really good. All right. We're going to give you these lidocaine shots. These suck and hurt more than your actual injury. And I don't know why, in the hundreds of years of anesthetic science and technology, we haven't found a way to make that suck less, but whatever. Get those shots in. And thumb's feeling good. Not fully numb, though, because I could still feel the needle on my wound. So didn't like the thought of maybe getting stitches. But by the time the numbing shots kind of kicked in, it stopped bleeding. So we taped it up, wrapped it up, and now I've just got like this big old thumb bandage. Big old hard thumb. Anyway, moral of the story. Urgent care, Harrisburg, North Carolina. Great job. All right. Urgent, check. Care, the best. All right. And so something positive happened, and they should be acknowledged for that. So a lot of times people would take this opportunity to complain, and I've certainly done that on this show, but I wanted to take a moment also because like these 3 stories are pretty short. So this was going to be like a 15-minute episode otherwise, but I gave you 10 more minutes of content that you mindlessly listen to on your commute to your terrible job or whatever you're doing. So you're welcome. let's get into story time. Story time. Story time. Story time? Story time. So this week we're going to be talking about the Dardanelles operation, the Peacemaker, and our first story here of the Hellburner. And this goes all the way back to the late 1500s during the 80 Years' War, in which several European nations fought each other over something probably ridiculous. During this, Queen Elizabeth I of England hired Italian engineer Federico Giambelli to help the city of Antwerp, which is the Netherlands, I think. But to help the city of Antwerp defend itself against Alexander Farnese's Spanish forces. Now, the Spanish, at this point in the war, had constructed this massive, heavily fortified bridge over the river Scheldt called the Puente Farnesio, which they planned to use as a blockade to then starve out the opposing population. In order for the Dutch and their allies to continue moving supplies in and out of Antwerp, this bridge needed to be destroyed. I don't understand the logic, because to me it seems like the bridge would be more convenient to use. So maybe you just capture the bridge from the Spanish instead of destroying. But hey, I don't know, man. 1600s, 1500s war rules probably a little different than today. And maybe they had perfectly good reasons for doing it. I'm not an expert on all of the war of the Middle Ages. All right. It's just whatever. So this guy, Giambelli, immediately decided that he was going to use fire ships loaded with preposterous amounts of explosives to blow up this bridge. He wanted to use 3 medium-sized merchant ships, but was only given 2 small ships, the Fortune and the Hoop. Even though it wasn't what he wanted, he needed 3. He got 2 tiny ones, whatever. He made it work. All right. He's going to work with what he was given. So he started by constructing fire chambers on these ships surrounded by brick floors and brick walls. The roof of this chamber was then made of old tombstones that were then sealed with lead. Giambelli then filled these chambers with 7,000 pounds of high-quality gunpowder, rocks, and iron shards. That's a lot. All right, that's over 3 tons of explosives and stuff that's going to go high and fast when it explodes. So, on April 4th, 1585, Giambelli launched 32 smaller fire ships up the river as a way to distract the Spanish. As the Spanish troops worked to extinguish these smaller fire ships that were coming in, and I mean, it sounds exactly what it sounds like, right? It's these tiny little ships, probably like little rowboats or whatever, that are just on fire. And that if they, float very slowly and crash into something, it's going to cause some damage, right? You don't want your stuff to burn up. So the Spanish, they see these 32 fire ships coming up the river. They start to try to, put these fires out. And while they're doing that, Giambelli launched the first ship, the Fortune, toward the bridge. However, it just drifted ashore along the riverbank and only partially exploded, doing very little damage. So the Spanish army, they see this first ship blow up, and it's a huge explosion, 7,000 pounds of explosives, blows up, and that gets their attention, as it should. So they gather on the bridge and the surrounding riverbank and literally start laughing out loud at this, pile of rubble at this point that, the Dutch and the British have tried to put together. But they soon saw the other ship, the Hoop, floating toward the bridge. And this time it wasn't going ashore. It was coming right at them. And the laughter stopped. And they were kind of getting freaked out. And a short time later, the ship gently just nudged one of the wooden pylons of the bridge and several anchored Spanish ships. And at first, nothing really happened. A small plume of smoke started coming up from a single burning fire on the deck of the ship. Nothing really alarming. But after a few minutes, group of curious Spanish soldiers ran down to this burning ship to kind of have a closer look, kind of see what was going on. And then suddenly a massive explosion, all right, bigger than what the Fortune did, gigantic explosion. The hoop immediately vaporized, all right. The blast also created a tsunami on the river and flooded several nearby forts along the basin. Houses several miles away in every direction were leveled. That's how big this explosion was. Anyone standing within earshot of the explosion was knocked to the ground. And then after a brief moment of silence, all right, you have this giant boom. All this massive explosion, shockwave goes out, tsunami goes up the river. And then a moment later, the sound of pieces of tombstone and marble and the remains of the Spanish soldiers who had gone down to the boat on the hoop began crashing and splatting to the earth. Over 60 years later, the 80 Years' War ended with the Spanish recognizing the independence of the Dutch Republic, thanks in part to John Belly's Hellburner ships, which is one of the oldest recorded uses of a weapon of mass destruction. So, fast forwarding here to 1807, 20 years after the Battle of Caransebes, which we discussed back on episode 190 with some other war stories. Basically, if you remember, I think it was the Austrians, they were fighting the Turkish people, and the Austrians were like freaking out because they got drunk on schnapps and they thought the Turkish people were attacking, and they basically just attacked themselves, killed 10,000 of their own people. Anyway, 20 years after that, the Ottomans were now at war with the British in what was known as the Anglo-Turkish War. The British, who were vastly superior, a bird just flew into the window and kind of scared me for a second there. Anyway, the British, they were vastly superior to the Ottoman army, and so they made a plan to invade the heart of Turkey through the Dardanelles Strait, one of the two narrow straits that connect the Aegean and Black Seas in northwestern Turkey. If you kind of know Turkey and their geography, it's one of those thin slits of water, kind of where Istanbul is, right? So the British, they arrived in February of 1807, and the Ottomans, who were extremely unprepared, tried to stall the British with negotiations that they knew were not going to go anywhere. But the British, being the polite people that they were, decided to play along and listen to them anyway. While those negotiations were going on, Turkish forces scrambled to set up cannons along the Dardanelles Strait, but they had one tiny problem. They didn't really have many cannons to set up, and it was also the final days of Ramadan, and many Turks and many of the Ottoman soldiers were just away from the battlefield doing their fasting and not being out during the day or whatever they do during Ramadan. You get it. So on February 19th, the British finally, they're like, these negotiations are stupid. We're going in. They entered the Dardanelles Strait and began advancing towards Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, without much resistance. When the British entered the Sea of Marmara, they found the Ottoman army and their secret weapon, the Dardanelles Gun, which was this massive 18.6 ton, 17 foot long cast bronze cannon, which in reality, it wasn't so much a secret weapon as it was basically the Ottomans' last remaining option. The gun really wasn't even a gun. It had just been this elaborate decoration that had been kind of posted up somewhere for the last 300 years. It had been built in 1494 by Sultan Mehmet II during the siege of Constantinople that signaled the end of the Byzantine Empire. The gun, I mean, it was a working gun, but it was really kind of a decoration. But it was designed to shoot a 670-pound cannonball over 5,000 feet, which is pretty impressive for something that was built in 1494, right? Like a 17-foot long gun, right? That's almost as tall as a 2-story house, for starters. So imagine that. And then imagine something that tall shooting a 670-pound cannonball nearly a mile away. That's pretty impressive for 1494. All right. Now, the problem, though, was that thanks to some bad math in the engineering of the gun, it didn't actually do that. All right. And so otherwise, this gun was pretty useless other than being a really nice decoration. Pretty cool looking, just a giant cannon that didn't actually work. Well, the Ottomans, realizing that their empire was dangerously close to failing, decided to dust off the Dardanelles gun and place it on a bluff overlooking the Dardanelles Strait at the mouth of the Sea of Marmara. Now, this time, rather than stuff it with cannonballs, the Ottomans just packed it full of stones and other random debris. Meanwhile, the British, thinking they've just got an easy ride into Constantinople to go win another war, were then surprised to hear a loud boom come from the cliffs along the strait, followed by a giant mass of random, hard, heavy objects raining down on their ships. And then after suffering a lot of unexpected but very severe damage to his fleet, Admiral Sir John Duckworth actually withdrew his troops without attempting an attack on Constantinople. And in 1867, 60 years after this failed attack, Sultan Abdulaziz visited Great Britain and actually gifted the Dardanelles gun to Queen Victoria because the Ottomans were just into subtle jabs like that. The Ottoman Empire eventually fell after World War I. But still, this massive cannon that had never really been used before, had been sitting there for 300 years, was reconstructed real quick and actually worked. Our final story here, it happened on February 27th, 1844, when President John Tyler hosted a public reception for Captain Robert F. Stockton, who had been doing a lot of work to help construct the USS Princeton, a screw steam warship for the Navy. The next day, on February 28th, President Tyler, members of his cabinet, Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, and over 400 others departed Alexandria, Virginia for a demonstration cruise on the newly christened warship along the Potomac River. To celebrate, Captain Stockton decided that he really wanted to impress the guests on board of the ship by firing the biggest of the two long guns on the ship. So this gun was called the Peacemaker. Had not been tested nearly as rigorously as the other guns on the other warships that the United States had, but Stockton didn't care. He fired two 225-pound shots 5 miles into the Virginia countryside to the crowd's delight, which has got to be wild, right? Like, you just it's 5 miles away. You don't know what's 5 miles away. And I get it. Like, it's still the 1800s. Virginia, especially this part of Virginia, you know, unlike Alexandria today, which is just this sprawling metropolis of suburbs for Washington, D.C., it's probably still pretty sparsely populated at this point. But still, just to willy-nilly shoot 2 cannonballs 5 miles, it's kind of silly. But anyway, following this demonstration, guests were impressed, and they went below the deck for lunch and to enjoy the rest of the cruise. But Stockton, he was not done. All right, he wanted to fire the gun one more time as a tribute to George Washington as they passed by Mount Vernon, George Washington's old estate. Well, when Stockton pulled the lever, the gun exploded, which is not what it was supposed to do. And rather than sending the cannonball across the river as it had done the previous 2 times, the gun sprayed the deck and the crowd that had gathered to watch the gun shoot one more time with a bunch of shrapnel. The Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of State, and 6 other people died when they were hit with this debris, while 20 more people were injured. President Tyler, who was not part of this because he didn't care about seeing something happen for a 3rd time, he had remained below deck and was unharmed. Julia Gardner, whose father, Senator David Gardner, had just been killed by the exploding gun, fainted out of fright and was carried off the ship by the president himself. So noble. During all of the chaos, this is because President Tyler, he was not married at this time. And so during this chaos, President Tyler actually decided to propose to Julia Gardner once she regained consciousness, which is wild. Even more wild because Tyler had already proposed to Gardner several times and had constantly been rejected and figured now was as good a time as ever to try again, which is crazy, right? Like the girl has just seen her dad get blown to pieces by this gun. She's fainted. She's scared. And then the president of the United States, who has been creeping her out for years and asking her to marry him, carrying her off the ship. She comes to, my darling, your father has died. Will you marry me? Become the first lady of the United States. Like, I don't know, man. Just pretty stupid. However, thinking that Tyler had bravely saved her life, he didn't really. Like, she wasn't really in any danger. She did finally accept this time. Because, like, whatever. Like, it's not like your life is going to get worse at that point, right? Like, you've just gone through a very traumatic event. You've survived a massive explosion. Your father just died. But now you're getting proposed to by the president of the United States. So like, you take what you can get, I guess. There you go. Weird weapons in the books. I mean, were they like weird by the dictionary definition? Probably not. I mean, they were just kind of extraordinary, like out of the ordinary. But it's the alliteration that matters. You probably don't even care. You were probably like, oh yeah, I learned some stuff. That's pretty weird. Good job, John. Anyway, whatever. Let's recap and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number one of the first uses of a weapon of mass destruction was this giant fire ship that was sent up a river to destroy a heavily fortified bridge. And it did. So there you go. Number two, the Ottomans in Turkey were really desperate. They did not want the British to come in and take over Constantinople. So they dusted off a 300-year-old cannon, stuffed it full of shrapnel, and it actually worked and scared the British so much that they thought the Turks were way more heavily armed and prepared than they actually were. And they turned around and went home and got to be an empire for another 100 years or so. And then lastly, number three, President John Tyler, right, was elected to office as a single guy, even though he had been trying to get Julia Gardner to marry him for years. And it took a tragedy, an exploding ship, and the death of her father, and him proposing after he had carried her off the ship himself. And she had lost conscience because she fainted, for her to accept and to become the first lady. Such a dumb story.
What did we learn?
Next week on Our Weird World, it is that time of year again. It is Serial Killer September. This year we have a theme, and it's going to be serial killers from around the world. So for 5 weeks, you get 5 Mondays in September this year. We're going to travel all around the world to different countries and continents to visit some different serial killers throughout history. We will have episodes on serial killers from Turkey. We'll have a couple of episodes on serial killers from Australia, serial killers from Asia, and then we will wrap up with some serial killers from Europe. Gonna be a big month as always, and then we will parlay that right on into October for our spooky themed episodes. This is the easiest time of the year for me to make to come up with episodes. So thank you so much for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.
a podcast.